The year was 1874, and the desert wind carried secrets only the lonely could understand. It swept across the wide plains, through dying brush and forgotten trails, whispering the memory of footsteps too tired to matter. Under that merciless sun, a woman walked barefoot, dust clinging to her like old regret. Her name, though few would ever hear it spoken then, was Naeli. For 2 days she had not eaten. For longer still, she had not been seen. The land stretched endlessly before her, an ocean of heat and silence. Her breath came shallow, each one a small rebellion against surrender. Her lips were cracked, her dark hair tangled with sand, but her eyes, those still burned with a quiet, stubborn fire. She had left behind something unspeakable. The smoke that had once risen from her village was gone now, leaving only the memory of ash on the wind. She walked not toward hope, but away from despair. By the second night, the stars hung above her like cold witnesses. Coyotes cried from the distant hills, but she no longer flinched. Fear had drained out of her somewhere between the hunger and the heat. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her chest, whispering a prayer in the language of her people, asking not for mercy, but for rest. Morning came sharp and cruel. She saw a faint shape on the horizon, wooden fences, a slanted roof, and smoke rising thin and steady. The smell of burning cedar reached her before she could believe it was real. A ranch, maybe half a mile ahead. Her feet stumbled toward it as if pulled by the memory of food, of safety. Her vision swam. Each step was heavier than the last. When she reached the door, her body gave way. She fell silently into the dust, the world closing over her like water. Elias Ward heard the thud before he saw her. He had been mending a saddle strap, humming to himself the way men do when they've forgotten what silence feels like. When the noise came, a soft collapse more than a sound, he turned, expecting to see one of his horses. Instead, he found her, a woman barely breathing, her skin sunburned and dry as parchment, lying on his porch like a ghost left by the desert. He froze. There were stories about Apache raids, about women who deceived to survive. His first thought was caution, his second was pity. He stepped closer, boots crunching on the dust. Her pulse fluttered beneath her jaw, fragile, but alive. He knelt beside her, brushed sand from her face, and felt something shift inside him, something old and half-buried. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was recognition, the kind a lonely man feels when he sees another soul who's been weathered by the same kind of emptiness. He lifted her, careful as if she were made of glass, and carried her inside. The room was dim, lit only by morning light slipping through old curtains. Clara, his housekeeper, a broad, motherly woman with quick eyes, looked up from her work. "Lord above," she whispered, setting down a basin. Elias laid the woman on the couch, his hands shaking slightly. "She's Apache," Clara said under her breath, nervous. Elias nodded. "She's starving." Clara hesitated only a moment before fetching water. Together they worked in silence, dampening her lips, covering her with a thin blanket. The fire crackled in the hearth, a fragile heartbeat against the wide emptiness of the plains. Hours passed before her eyes fluttered open. The first thing she saw was the ceiling, low and wooden, then the man sitting by her side. He was tall, his face lined but steady, the color of sun and work. He didn't speak at first, neither did she. The air between them was thick with things unspoken, fear, curiosity, mistrust. She tried to sit up, but he raised a hand gently. "Don't," he said quietly. "You're safe." The words sounded strange to her, shaped in a tongue she barely understood, but the tone needed no translation. Safety. It had been a long time since she'd felt that word. She lay back down, exhausted. He offered her water again. Her fingers trembled as she took it. When she drank, it wasn't just thirst she was quenching. It was the slow return to being human. For the next few days, she stayed in that small ranch house between waking and sleep. Clara watched her with guarded sympathy, while the ranch hand, a boy named Tommy, peeked around corners with wide eyes. To them, she was a mystery that carried danger. But to Elias, she was a reminder of fragility, of survival, of how easily a soul can be stripped bare. When he worked outside, He found himself glancing toward the window, half expecting to see her watching. Once he did. She stood behind the curtain, her face pale but alert, the kind of look people have when they're deciding whether the world will allow them to keep living. On the fourth morning, she tried to leave. Elias found her at the door, wrapped in a shawl Clara had given her, still weak but determined. She didn't speak, only looked at him with eyes that said everything. Gratitude, pride, fear of owing someone anything. He didn't stop her with force. Only words. You can't walk far. Not yet. Her eyes narrowed. She wanted to argue, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. Slowly, she sank back into the chair by the fire. He nodded once and went back to his chores, pretending it hadn't mattered to him that she'd stayed. By evening, she began to eat small portions of stew. Clara tried to speak to her in broken words, gestures mostly, and she responded with nods or soft murmurs in her own tongue. Elias listened from across the room, never intruding. There was a stillness between them that was not silence. It was understanding. Both had lived too long with ghosts. Both had learned that trust, like spring rain, came only after long drought. That night, when the desert winds howled against the walls, Nayeli woke with a start. A dream had shaken her, smoke, screams, her brother's voice lost in the chaos. She sat up, heart pounding. From the other room came the soft scrape of a chair. Elias appeared in the doorway, lamp in hand. "You're all right," he said quietly. She looked at him, eyes wet, chest heaving. "I dream." He nodded. "Dreams don't hurt you here." For the first time, she believed him. She lay back down, staring at the flicker of the fire until it blurred into sleep again. When dawn came, Elias stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky still pink with morning. He looked at the porch where he'd found her. The dust had been swept away, but the memory lingered like a scar, gentle, permanent. Inside, he heard Clara humming, and the faint sound of dishes clinking told him the woman was awake, moving slowly, part of the rhythm of the house. For reasons he couldn't name, the silence felt different now, less empty, more like waiting. Something had shifted in the air, a story beginning without either of them realizing it. He didn't know what she would become to him, nor what past she carried, only that fate had placed her at his door. And as he watched the horizon blaze with light, Elias Ward felt, for the first time in years, that he was not entirely alone. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of morning, and somewhere in its song was the faintest echo of a promise, one that neither of them yet understood, but both were already bound to follow. The year was 1875, and the prairie was beginning to bloom again after a long winter that had nearly broken the land. Elias Ward rose before the sun most mornings, his boots whispering over the wooden floor, the kettle hissing softly like an old friend. The ranch had settled into a quiet rhythm, but there was a difference now, a soft presence that filled the spaces where loneliness once lived. Nayeli moved through the house with silent grace, her steps measured, her eyes carrying the calm of rivers yet untamed. What began as cautious coexistence had become something wordless and fragile, a peace neither dared name. The days came in gentle repetition. She worked beside him in the stables, feeding horses, mending fences, learning each task by watching. Her English grew slowly, shaped by need rather than comfort, and his understanding of her silences deepened in return. They spoke less with words and more with gestures, a nod, a look, a pause long enough to be felt. Sometimes, when the dust turned the fields gold, he'd glance at her and wonder how someone could seem both wounded and whole in the same breath. Nayeli had begun to smile again, though it was a quiet, uncertain smile. When Clara teased her, she laughed softly, as if afraid the sound might vanish if she made it too loud. Tommy, ever curious, followed her around like a shadow, asking questions she couldn't always answer. There was something healing in the ordinary, in the way the house smelled of stew and wood smoke instead of dust and fear. Yet under that calm, something else stirred, a tension that neither could name, born not of danger but of unspoken longing. One evening, after days of heavy rain, the ground smelled of wet clay and cedar. Elias came and soaked from mending a fence and found her by the fire, braiding her dark hair with fingers that moved like memory. He paused at the doorway, unsure why his chest felt tight. She looked up, her gaze steady but unreadable. For a moment, time seemed to slow. He wanted to speak, to say something that would explain the quiet ache inside him, but the words refused to come. Instead, he hung his coat, nodded once, and sat across from her. "You work too hard," she said slowly, each word careful, shaped by her accent. He smiled faintly. "Work keeps me alive." She tilted her head, thinking, then answered, "So does rest." It was such a simple thing, yet it struck him like truth often does. Quiet, undeniable, undeserved. They sat without speaking after that, only the sound of rain against the window and fire breathing between them. By spring, the whispers had begun in town. People noticed her when Elias came in for supplies. Some averted their eyes. Others didn't bother to hide their scorn. An Apache woman living under a white man's roof. Such things had a way of burning through gossip like dry grass. Elias ignored it at first, though he felt the weight of every stare. When he rode back to the ranch, dust clinging to his boots, Nayeli saw it in his face. "They do not like me," she said one evening. He didn't deny it. "They don't understand you." She looked at him, the firelight painting her eyes in shades of amber and sadness. "Do you?" The question cut through him, and he realized he didn't fully. But he wanted to. That, he thought, was enough for now. One night, the tension broke. A wagon from town stopped outside the ranch, and two men stepped down, neighbors, drunk, bold with ignorance. Elias met them at the porch. They spoke rough words, warning him about keeping her kind too close. When he told them to leave, one spat at the ground, muttering curses that turned the air bitter. Nayeli stood behind the curtain, her hand trembling at her side. She saw Elias straighten, calm but fierce. His voice did not rise, yet it carried weight. "This is my land," he said evenly, "and she's under my care. That's the end of it." The men left, but not before throwing a look that promised trouble. After the sound of their wagon wheels faded, the house went quiet again. Nayeli stepped outside, the night air cool on her face. He turned to her, expecting fear, but saw something else instead, resolve. "You defend me," she said softly. He shrugged, though his throat felt tight. "You shouldn't have to fight alone." Her eyes glistened in the dim light. "You fight for me," she whispered, "but not for yourself." He didn't know what she meant then, but he carried the words with him like a splinter under skin. As days passed, a shift took hold, gentle but sure. Nayeli began tending to the horses more confidently, riding the smaller mare with grace that reminded Elias of the wind itself. He taught her how to read small words carved on old books he kept by the hearth. In turn, she taught him her language, phrases that rolled like music through the quiet evenings. When she said his name in Apache, it sounded softer, almost sacred. Still, something within her resisted belonging. One morning, she packed what little she owned, a woven shawl, a small knife, a pouch of seeds, and saddled the horse. She thought leaving might protect him from the world's cruelty, from the judgment that had begun to stalk his peace. As she tightened the reins, Elias appeared from the barn. He didn't raise his voice or plead. He simply stood there, the dawn light falling across his face, making him look both older and younger at once. "You don't have to run," he said quietly. "I bring you trouble," she replied, her voice breaking. "Your people hate me." He took a slow step forward. "Then let them. I've lived too long fearing people who don't know what love costs." The word hung between them, love, and neither dared breathe. Nayeli's eyes filled, and for a moment she looked as if she might still leave. But then something broke open inside her, the hard shell of survival giving way to something tender. She dismounted slowly, her knees trembling. When he reached her, she didn't step back. His hand brushed hers, a simple touch, but it felt like the ground itself had shifted. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. They planted seeds together, fixed the roof, and laughed more freely. Clara watched them with quiet satisfaction, Tommy with awe. The ranch, once a lonely patch of earth, began to hum with life. And yet, they never spoke much of what had grown between them. It existed beyond words, built from the language of care, of presence, of staying. One evening, under a wide purple sky. Elias took her hand and led her to the open field where wildflowers had begun to bloom. There was no preacher, no audience, only the two of them and the wind that had carried her to him once before. "You're home now," he said softly. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from release. The past no longer clung so tightly. She saw in his eyes not salvation but partnership, not pity but pride. For the first time, she felt the earth beneath her feet as hers. They stood there for a long time, watching the horizon melt into gold. Somewhere in the distance, the cry of a hawk echoed across the plains, a sound sharp and free. The years ahead would bring hardship, they both knew that. But as the fireflies began to shimmer in the twilight, Elias and Nayeli understood something truer than fear, that love, when born of courage and kindness, could root even in the harshest soil. The wind moved through the tall grass like a hymn, carrying their laughter far across the empty land, as if promising that their story was only beginning. The year was 1877, and the plains had grown restless under the weight of summer. The air shimmered with heat, and even the cicadas seemed tired of their own songs. On the Ward Ranch, the earth cracked underfoot, thirsty for rain that would not come. Nayeli worked in the garden, sweat tracing lines down her neck, her hands moving with quiet purpose. She had learned to read the signs of the land as she once had read the patterns of the stars. But now, it was the sky that refused to listen, and the ground that began to whisper unease. Elias watched her from the porch, his heart split between admiration and fear. They had built something sacred out of solitude, but the world beyond their fences was not done testing them. By now, the town had stopped speaking his name kindly. To them, Elias Ward had chosen the wrong side of decency, and no good could come from it. He no longer attended meetings or suppers, and when he passed through for supplies, silence followed him like a shadow. Men he once called friends turned away, and women whispered behind curtained windows. Nayeli saw what it cost him. Though he never spoke of it, he carried the insult quietly, the way men do when pride must be buried for love to survive. She, in turn, tried to bring joy into the silence, soft songs in the early morning, the smell of herbs drying on the windowsill, small gestures that stitched life back into the house. Yet there were cracks forming where words should have been. Elias had grown quieter, heavy with the knowledge that the world beyond their walls was sharpening its judgment. Nayeli felt it too, the distance between their hearts widening not from lack of love, but from the exhaustion of defending it. One evening, she found him sitting outside long after dusk, staring toward the horizon where lightning flickered without rain. She joined him without a word. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked after a long silence. His voice was rough, not with anger but with fear. She turned her face toward him, eyes reflecting the storm. "Leave what?" "This place. Me. The weight that comes with both." Nayeli shook her head slowly. "I have wandered enough. I am not made for running anymore." He nodded, though doubt clung to his gaze. The wind stirred, carrying the smell of distant smoke. They both looked toward the east. Somewhere far off, the land burned, lightning, perhaps, or something darker. The next morning brought strangers to their gate. A group of riders, dusty and impatient, stopped near the fence line. One called out for Elias. His voice was familiar, the sheriff's. The conversation that followed was quiet but strained. Someone had accused them of harboring stolen cattle, a lie built on prejudice, more than proof. Elias knew it was nonsense, yet the accusation carried danger. Men in that town didn't need evidence when they had suspicion. When the riders left, promising to look into things, Elias stood still for a long time. Nayeli came to his side. "They will come again," she said softly. He nodded. "I know." In the days that followed, they lived beneath a tension so fine it hummed. Every sound seemed louder: the creak of the barn door, the cry of a hawk, the footsteps of a man walking alone. Clara and Tommy spoke less, sensing the shift in the air. It was as though the ranch itself had gone still, holding its breath. Then came the night the storm finally broke. Rain fell in fierce, uneven sheets, drumming against the roof like the rhythm of war. Nayeli stood by the window, the firelight trembling across her face. Elias was at the barn, trying to secure the horses. She saw the glow before she heard the sound. Fire, bright and unnatural, spreading along the far fence. Shouts followed, and the unmistakable crack of gunfire. She ran barefoot into the rain. The world was chaos, lightning tearing open the sky, fire consuming the dry grass. Elias was near the fence, rifle in hand, shouting for her to stay back. The attackers fled when the thunder cracked close, fear overtaking rage. She reached him, breathless, her dress clinging to her skin. One look told her he was hurt, a graze along his shoulder, blood mixing with rain. He tried to downplay it, saying it was nothing, but she saw through the lie. They spent the night, fighting the fire until it burned itself out in the wet earth. When dawn came, the ranch stood wounded but alive. Smoke rose from the edges of the fields, like ghosts lifting away. Inside, she cleaned his wound in silence. He winced but didn't stop her. The air between them was thick with what could have been lost. "They won't stop," he said finally. "Next time they'll come for more than fences." She tied the bandage firmly, meeting his eyes. "Then let them find us ready." That morning marked something unspoken. From then on, she worked beside him not as a guest or a wife, but as an equal. She learned to shoot, to mend wire, to balance the books. He, in turn, began to let her make choices he once made alone. Their bond deepened not through peace, but through shared endurance. Every hardship was a thread that wove them tighter together. Months passed. The gossip faded, as gossip always does when it finds no new fuel. The town moved on to other scandals. The ranch healed slowly, fences mended, fields replanted. Life crept back into its rhythm, quieter, humbler. Naeli grew stronger, her laughter more frequent. Elias carried new scars, but there was a steadiness in him that hadn't existed before. They spoke often now, about dreams of expansion, of bringing in more horses, maybe even a small school for the children of the valley, where no one would care who their parents were. Yet even as contentment returned, Naeli often stood by the edge of the field at twilight, staring toward the horizon. She thought of her people, of what was lost, and of what she had found in return. Love had not erased her past, but it had given it meaning, a bridge between what she had been and what she had become. Elias would come to her then, standing close but silent. He understood that some griefs could not be touched, only shared by standing near them. When autumn came, the land softened again. The sky turned wide and forgiving, and the nights carried the scent of harvest. On one of those evenings, as the firelight flickered in their home, Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. Inside was a pressed wildflower, fragile but still bright. "I found it near the door the day you came," he said. "Thought it might have been yours." She touched it gently, her voice barely a whisper. "It is now." He smiled at that, and she leaned against him, her head resting where his heart beat slow and sure. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, soft as a promise. Years later, when travelers passed through the valley, they spoke of a ranch where peace lingered like perfume, where the woman with the dark hair and quiet eyes ruled beside a man who once believed he had no more to give. They said their laughter could sometimes be heard on the wind, mingling with the song of the plains. But that was later. For now, in that still evening, as the fire cracked and the sky deepened to indigo, Elias and Naeli simply sat together, hands entwined, knowing the worst had passed but life would keep testing them. And in that understanding was something deeper than triumph, something like grace, the kind that makes a story feel endless even after it's told.